Ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between, this is DebateSensei, NPDA edition, where we talk about things relevant to competitive parliamentary debate at the college level. I have the webmaster for NPTE, as well as a newly minted tenured professor at Diablo Valley, Paul Villa. Thank you so much for being here, Paul.
You know, the best part is that we actually have a website now. Like, I don't know if you saw, but the website's finally up. So now I'm really the webmaster. Like, it's all been a lie until now.
I did see that. Yes. So NPTE is back up. Oh, and not to get too far off on this tangent, though, but every once in a while, my students would want to know what I accomplished. I'm like, yeah, you could go check it out on the NPTE website. But I guess stuff from 20 years ago.
We're trying to recover the records because obviously the MPT used to have all the results, but it's proving very challenging because basically no one had them backed up except for the person who was in charge, who, as I mentioned, is no longer. So there's some challenge there that we're working on figuring out, but yeah.
There's something poetic about letting that just dissolve into history as well. I'm okay with it. I'm at peace with it. So not that matters, but anyways, what we wanted to do in this episode, because parliamentary debate has a different topic every time, every once in a while, I like to take final rounds and just do a deep dive, discuss what arguments you might make on them, discuss some arguments that were made on them, and just basically have a conversation around it. And so, because you are in the Northern California Forensics Association, thought we'd take the final round from the recent Spring Championship and take a look at that. And that topic is that the United States federal government should establish a permanent moon base. So I've had some debates about just developing the moon, but a permanent moon base adds a little bit of detail there that could alter the trajectory of that debate.
So I got to talk to Jeff Toney, who's the president of the NCFA, and he's the one who wrote the topic. Afterwards about why he picked this topic. And he was telling me that, I guess, and this is the year before I started doing LD, but 2014, 2015, the NFALD resolution was the United States federal government should increase its development of the Earth's moon in one or more of the following areas: energy, minerals, and or water. And I guess that his team at that time had read something about establishing a moon colony or a moon base that did that. And he thought that was a really interesting debate. And so that's kind of how he landed on doing the topic. And specifically, he was really into having the word permanent in there as opposed to non-permanent, because he thinks that gives the negative better ground for disads while also allowing the app some more solvency.
I remember that topic. I always love doing obscure interpretations of it, and I never got to run it, but I did research a plan on creating your own moon water. It is a Wiccan ritual in which you harness the energy from the moon. And I thought that was hilarious. And
there was a lot of that kind of going on at the time. And so very interesting things going on as it pertains to that topic. But yeah, in terms of this topic, I can say, so my team was in the final round and ultimately won on a 2-1 decision. And I can tell you that from our perspective, when we first heard the topic, we spent like literally 30 seconds thinking about the actual topic and whether we wanted to defend it before just immediately pivoting to doing a KAF, which is not common for DVC at all. Like we read, I think this was our second KAF the entire year. And basically the circumstances in this specific context that led to it for us was we looked at our judging panel and we saw that it was like 3 like techie judges, right? And so we're like, okay, most likely these people are willing to at least hear out the K. We looked at our opponent, and it was the University of the Pacific. And it was specifically one of their teams that's like, I think it's a junior and a sophomore or something. And so my thought process was, okay, these people probably aren't super ready for a KF. And insofar as they are, they're probably just going to read the K that they usually read, which is anthropocentrism.
Right.
And I could see the links there kind of as it pertains to things like the moon and leaving behind the earth where all the animals are. And like, it's very human. Space. Like, and also the arguments about like space exploitation, where like space exploration in the beginning was sending up animals into space to die. Essentially.
Yes.
So basically, I saw where it was headed. And ultimately we read a Marxist critique on the because we wanted to just be ahead on all the questions of like, why do animals suffer? And why is space exploration and like, trying to get resources out of space bad and tap? But when I think of it more on the actual topic rather than what we did in the moment, I think that for me, this is a pretty significantly negative-sided topic.
Oh, really?
I don't know what your take is off the bat, but I think that there's some interesting things that were going on in the world when this topic came up that even more neg-sided than it otherwise might have been. Because this was the same week that it had been announced that, and we have different information now, but it had been announced that the White House has had a briefing and every member of Congress had been briefed because Russia had essentially put a nuclear weapon in space.
The
day before. And so the concern for us was obviously there's pretty good ground like this sort of weaponization of space stuff, or like tensions very high in space now. And if we have to defend that, well, the United States, in response to this, anti-satellite weapon or whatever that Russia has put in or has not put into space, is going to just establish a moon colony immediately.
Right.
It just seemed like we were going to be hosed. I also felt that the word permanent was a big detriment to the affirmative because there's, a fair amount of laws as it pertains to things like being able to just claim the moon for yourself to the United States or whatever, whether that's things like the Outer Space Treaty or other international agreements. And so it was genuinely about 30 seconds into prep where I was like, I don't think we can win on this app if we go straight up, because it seems like a lot of sort of like politics scenarios and war scenarios are against us. And that, in comparison to the app ground we get, which is like space exploration good, launching pad for like future operate. Because the problem was, essentially for us, the real problem was this: all of the disad links and impacts happen instantly. Like the perception links, the violating of these massive treaties, those happen instantly. And if we start building the moon base tomorrow, we don't have one for at least a decade.
That's true. So now the first thing that I jumped to, because I'm somewhat versed in this, was the space treaty of, was it 67 or something like that? Yeah, something along those lines. And I'm pretty sure it explicitly prohibits the development of bases on there, like very, very clearly. So all right. So I just making sure, I double checking that I was right on that one.
And our argument when we were thinking about going straight up for like those 30 seconds or 1 minute or whatever was that, well, we'll spin this as Russia doing the space weapon thing violates the OST. Clearly, the OST is not binding for states anymore, which means like all that matters is the United States. Like if everyone's going to violate the treaty, inevitably, we do not want to be the last one to violate it. Like, let's just say, forget this treaty and go there now. But again, that sounded bad.
Yeah. So we I get it. Being on the affirmative is automatically a challenge. But let's jump into it. All right. Let's say that you got a novice team, but you got extended prep time, so not quite enough to give them a foundation on what a critique is or how to run a critique, but they've done enough policy where you're like, all right, let's try to just be straight up topical with this. What do you think? You already started on the strategy about how to answer the treaty stuff, but is there any other offense that you could get on case for building a moon base?
So I think the classic argument, which I don't know that I'm the biggest fan of, but I get, is get off the rock.
Get off the rock.
Yeah. In terms, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, it's basically the idea that like, whether it's because of climate change, nuclear weapons, or just some, asteroid hitting the Earth, at some point, if we are not a interplanetary species, if we do not have the ability to live off of the Earth, everyone's probably going to die. And given things like climate change, that might happen sooner than we think. And so establishing a moon base, whether that is like as a place for some small colony of humans to live, or more importantly, as a launching place for other space endeavors, could potentially be effective and useful. And I think that's kind of the main argument, and because it basically gets you to these sort of extinction level impacts, like because that's probably is going to happen if we don't make significant changes. And I think that that's probably the first place we were thinking of going. The secondary thought process was about trying to think about some of the areas from the LD topic from back in the day in terms of, okay, well, is there an energy angle? Is there a minerals angle? Is there a water angle? And then we started thinking about things like, okay, well, is there some advantage about establishing terraforming technology? Where basically the premise being that if whatever the app does somehow does bolster our ability to terraform environments to be more sustainable, we could then leverage that technology on Earth as opposed to on places like the moon or Mars, and then make those habitable, which could solve also for some of those climate change impacts. But the problem, again, in all of these instances is the time frame debate. Because the app just is going to be behind on time frame kind of regardless. Even if we think about, in my mind, the simplest dissect, which is the required amount of launches to get what you need for a moon base would have such devastating impacts for the environment, right? Because obviously shooting rockets up is hard.
That's right.
Difficult, and the more heavy the rocket in terms of like what you're bringing, and when you're building a permanent moon colony, that's the whole thing. Like, not going to be great. And obviously, you don't in modern parley, no one reads like F spec. No one's like, "What's your funding mechanism?" or whatever.
I think
there's also some big problems there where it's like in a 2024 election year, where inflation's like the highest it's ever been, and there's like a 38% approval rate for Joe Biden. Joe Biden is going to spend $1 trillion to build a moon colony. And so just the more we thought about it, the more we were like, wow. Yeah. Like, I think it's one of those weird things where, like, I think it's probably a bad idea in general. I think it's excited in general. But I think at the exact moment we were given the topic, it was just horrible. Given the political climate of both the United States, international politics, weaponization of space, treaties, all of those sorts of things.
All that the political stuff does start jumping to mind. I start trying to do the mental gymnastics of how do I get out of some of those positions, and none of them are very satisfying. The closest I'm getting to, just off the top of my head, is just because the United States is building it doesn't mean it has to be solely for US purposes. Like, it could build an international moon base, but we are the only ones with the money or the history enough to build something that works. So therefore we'll do it for everybody. Not the best, not the most persuasive in my opinion, but that's how I'm trying to wrestle myself out of some of these negative positions that are rearing their head.
Yeah, and I think some of the spin on it, as far as the politics stuff, in our mind, if we were going to do it, was going to be something to the effect of like, this is perceived by Republicans as like us actually counterbalancing against Russia right after they put this weapon in space. And like, even if it's not actually military based, like it gives off military vibes, and maybe that makes some people happy with Biden or whatever. But obviously that feels fairly tenuous compared to a lot of the negative grounds. There's, if it was CC style, right? Like if I was in front of a CC panel, or if I was in like an IPDA debate, I think I would try and sort of pivot away from the sort of standard, uniqueness to impact level, advantage, disadvantage, like actual tangible, quantifiable impacts. And instead probably would have focused on something about like space exploration as like a concept is important for like humanity and for the species. And I know that there's some arguments in terms of like the economic impact stuff where it says like every dollar we spend on space, we get $4 back or something.
Right. On the ingenuity and the innovation.
But and I think that at least like, okay, and once again, that is a time frame thing, because like, but when do we get that dollar? And I also, the last thought I had before we vetoed out of it was, we do the plan, but argue that it fails, and then that's a good thing.
Okay. Yeah.
This is the tricky strat that comes
Yeah.
up every once in a while on certain topics, where you like, yes, we do that thing, and it goes awful, which just decks all of our international credibility.
Yeah.
And that's good because it will solve all these issues because the United States is no longer perceived as trustworthy or whatever. Like, you know, it causes people to pivot to China. China as the new superpower is preferable to the United States, whatever. But again, it was just like, how do we like the amount of steps we have to win, like all the chains in terms of where you can attack us did not feel great in the moment.
Yeah, yeah. The one other thing that gets you a little bit more on the uniqueness angle is the very recent developments in fusion energy.
Yes.
That it just became fusion energy just became viable. Like they can't produce it commercially yet. But one of the things they need is the right material. And guess what? On the moon, it has a whole bunch of helium-3, which is perfect for fusing into energy. And so, I don't know, you could just go hard for like, hey, fusion energy is too important to leave up to a freaking 50-year-old space treaty. Sorry, but we're just going forward with it.
Yeah, I think again, all of it comes back to seemingly the same thing, which is climate change, right? I think like in which I love climate change debate. I think I mentioned this, but my favorite topic in the world is like the United States should invest in nuclear energy, or nuclear energy is preferable to solar energy, or whatever. Because I just think climate change debates are fantastic because like it really does come down to who just knows more of their stuff, like who can actually explain the uniqueness and whatnot. But yeah, it's like in debates like this where it's space related or technology related, it's almost always a race to who solves climate change or who mitigates climate change or gets like technology spillover arguments. And obviously all those things are very important. But the other problem, again, another reason the AF's in a tough spot, is counterplans exist. And in the case of Pacific, which, you know, because we're always thinking at DVC, like when we can, we're thinking about who our opponent is, who our judges. And if for folks who don't know, Pacific has a rule on their team that they must advocate every advocacy unconditionally.
Okay.
So they're not allowed to be condo, which usually is exciting when we're the AF because we're like, okay, cool, because we know that if they read the counterplan. But the problem is we're like, bro, there's just like 10 really good counterplans. Why wouldn't like obviously consult is not great, and like you could argue that it's theoretically illegitimate. Bro, if there's ever a consult counterplan that like is probably legitimate, this seems like it, because all of that stuff we just talked about with the Outer Space Treaty and whatnot, and whatnot. I think temporary moon base is probably another option.
So I was wondering about that.
Like, but unmanned missions is probably a better option. Like, there's just a lot of counterplans that seem to solve the vast majority of the AF while avoiding all of the dissects. Like, we can send as many drones as we want to the moon. There's no rule against it. And so I don't know. I just don't know what the AF is.
Well, really on the AF, it doesn't necessarily say that, you know, you have to staff the base with human beings.
See, this was the problem. The word like establish or whatever, we're like, do we have to just defend that it gets built?
Yeah.
Or that we like put a flag in the ground? Or do we have to
Oh man, do you have a flag? Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the neg strats then. So the triggering a freaking melee in the world seems to be the easiest one to go for, like you were talking about. That like I guess it would be a Russia disadvantage, but you could do a Russia China.
Yes.
Yeah, like you could do either one. Like you do one then the other, or just like we're gonna put the link scenarios together in a single disadvantage. Russia and China are gonna be freaking pissed about this. Yeah, and I mean, like, we already have the Ukraine scenario going on. It's like, you think, like, I mean, it's not that hard to spin a story about where this would go with United States basically flexing like this.
Well, and I think the other thing is, like, as it pertains to Ukraine. So number one, like, obviously there's like the Russia backlash, like we're weaponizing space, militarizing space, claiming space, whatever. But two, on that front, like, if there's any, I don't know that there's great uniqueness for this right now, but if there's any uniqueness for Ukraine aid will pass now, there is zero chance Ukraine aid passes in a world where Biden authorized spending $1 trillion on the moon.
Yeah. That's a good DA. I like that.
Yeah, and like any politics DA that you want, right? Like it's elections, it's also specific bills. Like it's just there's just a lot of native ground here, and I also do think the T's. One of the first things I always think about is like what's the T ground for like both sides.
Right.
I think establish is a super important word. I think the word base in and of itself is important
I
because
was
when
going
I
to
think
ask
about a
that.
base, bases are in my mind, and I'm sure I have to look up an actual definition. Bases in my mind, by definition, are manned.
Or what?
Like that is what makes a base a base. There are no military bases that are unmanned. There are no like
Oh,
Arctic bases that are unmanned, right? Like I'd have
huh.
to look it up, but to
I
me, a
wonder.
base almost by definition seems to imply it is staffed by people, right?
Okay, okay. I think that's a valid observation. I wonder, like, from a debater's perspective, I'm like, all right, so this will be the first one that isn't. So whatever, like,
Sure, sure,
it's
sure.
like
Yeah, yeah.
you guys, it's like words change, like meanings change, and this is like the first moon base ever. So the first base to not be like, I mean, you might be able to get out of that one pretty easy. But I'm wondering if there is, like, I guess there's non-military
See, and
base.
that's exactly what I'm looking at right now because a lot of these definitions of base are like a permanent military installation, a
Yeah,
place where military operations begin. And I think, yeah, like the NAG's going to try and peg you to that, and you're going to have a hard time defending that. Like that's not what we should have to defend.
yeah, it's not going to be a scientific laboratory base, right? Like that, you don't call those things like, and so just like exploration and development of like resources is not the thing. It's like it has to have some military purpose, even if that's not the primary purpose. It has to have those capabilities, and that's all you need for a link scenario.
Yeah,
It
I
sounds like
think there's also some like awful culture jamming apps
mm,
potentially on this topic, right?
culture
As we're
training AFs, huh?
Yeah. So like I don't know if you've seen culture. I haven't seen culture jamming myself in a lot of time. The last team I know that read a culture jamming app was Alex and Gabe when they were
Mm,
like juniors. Maybe seniors. So before that it was like San Diego in 2014. But they do these things where they do the topic in like a silly way and like that disruptive
yeah,
communication, whatever. But I think that when I hear like establish a permanent moon base, it's like, okay, we're building a baseball field. We're gonna put first base or like a home base, or like a way, and like some like American exceptionalism. This is stupid, whatever. Like, I would never culture jam. I think it's silly, but
mm,
like I guess as far as like people being able to play with the topic, there's some room there. But the problem is, anytime the AF has to worry about high quality diss ads and pretty reasonable topicality arguments and a potentially infinite number of counterplans that solve the AF,
yeah.
we're just in trouble, right? That's not
You're in
even
a
to
bad
mention
spot.
K's, right? Like I'm
You're in a
sure
bad spot.
every K links to building a base on the moon. Like you're
Yeah, yeah. Now I do have an interest. Like, I I think that the context of space really does give pause to the colonialism critique, because on face, the colonialism critique, I think, is just intuitive.
oh
Absolutely,
yeah.
right? You're just building stuff in these areas, but in the I don't know. I really would like to have more conversations about what it means to colonize space, because it seems like a lot of the problems with colonialism is that there are prior inhabitants.
Yeah.
What does that mean when there are not only no prior inhabitants, but no life forms at all that we can speak of other than
Yeah.
the ones that we put there? And so I'd like to talk about that a little bit. What do you think? Does that problematize the colonialism critique at all? Does it create
I
different?
definitely think it does because I think like in front of me certainly it would, right? Because like
Okay.
when cross X happens, if you know what you're doing in cross X, and you're just like, who gets colonized when we go to the moon?
Right. Right.
Is like the first question, right? And like, well, no, you claim the land. Okay, does that land currently belong to someone else?
Hmm.
It's like, okay, no. So no one lives there. It doesn't belong to anyone else. Who
Right.
gets hurt from this thing, right? Which is why I think that back when I was competing, there were at least two Ks people read about moon stuff and space stuff that came up fairly frequently. One of them, people like affectionately refer to as like Whitey on the moon.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with this. I
No.
had this explained to me by Steve years ago, and so I have to Google it to completely remember. But basically, it's like a typically like an anti-blackness position associated with like moon type stuff and like space type stuff.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, it was the result of like I want to say a young black woman, but I could be wrong. But basically, they like wrote letters to the president about like going to the moon. I think it was like when JFK was like doing all this stuff and was talking
Okay.
about. And there's like a whole thing there. But basically, like there's like, yeah, the idea of like the moon being a place where like when we talk about colonizing the moon and the next society on the moon, that is like what is being pictured is like a white, idyllic, like new place for rich
Oh,
white
okay.
people to go, sort of thing. The other one being like just space frontierism, which is the sort of set call type stuff.
Right.
Expansion. I think cap is probably better than both of those in this instance because like this in cap, it doesn't necessarily matter that there aren't people there, like, because people will be exploited in the process of you getting there, and once you get there, you are purely getting there to exploit the resources, obviously.
That's interesting.
But I think you're probably right that like if someone read like Settler colonialism on this, I'd be very confused and be like, I don't know. Like, yes, I guess people are settling a place, but like, I don't know that that's what your authors talked about. I don't know that Tucky and Yang were talking about the moon.
The thing is, it seems so intuitive, right? Because you have people that are taking a journey to move to a new place and take it over, and like the critique that seems to work in all other scenarios has an asterisk next to it for this particular context. If you're doing, I've had discussions about people like whether or not we should, I think a related topic is whether or not we should assume extraterrestrials would be hostile. I think, which is I love that debate. I love that debate.
I don't know if you did a video on last year. You did, didn't you have a video on last year's NPDA finals?
I believe so. NPDA. What was it?
So the NPDA final topic was about like establishing a first contact policy for like extraterrestrial life or something.
Yeah,
like
I do think so.
Yeah, kind of in that similar vein. Yeah, totally. About like, should we do that?
So like whether or not we should assume that they would be hostile is part of that. Is some people making the argument, it's like, well, what if they're coming here for resources? I'm like, man, okay, imagine some advanced society that has the capabilities of interstellar travel. What resources could we possibly offer that society that they would need to travel here to take it, that they couldn't get from any of the asteroids that they are passing by with zero inhabitants whatsoever? And so I'm like, when you start thinking about the expansiveness of space, it really does put a different spin on a lot of the arguments we make in debate about scarce resources, because those resources they're not scarce as in terms of like proportionality. How much, like, you know, how much gold is in the asteroid belt right now that we could if we had the capabilities of harvesting it and using it for electronics and currency and stuff like that, it is obscene. It is ridiculous. It is like, so like, yeah, I think the context of space, I really like it. It kind of adds it makes people think outside of the normal, like, international relations sort of framework that people come from.
One thing that I'm realizing looking at the topic that for some reason did not pop out to me at the time, I think the other squirrely, as long as you're good at answering T strategy, is the resolution, to the exact words of the resolution, where the USFG should establish a permanent base on the moon, not the Earth's moon, which is different than the LD topic. The LD topic specialized the Earth, specified the Earth's moon, and I think you could probably make an argument about like going to Mars's moon or Jupiter's moon, and like how basically like further space expansion in that direction would actually potentially be useful as opposed to the moon. Well,
in
there,
that would be fascinating.
But but again, now you have to beat T. All the dissets still link, but you're just maybe having a slightly different version of the affirmative.
I mean, you could, like, so Mars doesn't have a moon per se, or that you could really establish a base on, but Jupiter definitely does.
Yeah,
and I think Saturn's got, is it Europa? And Europa, I think Europa has like the people are thinking that there might be bacteria already on there, so like just searching for life, like, and so the search for extraterrestrial, like maybe a permanent base there, even if there isn't life, and you're just, I don't know. That would be wild. That would be absolutely wild. Okay, I do want to know a little bit more about the actual critique that you ran, though. You did hint at it, but you did a cap critique, you said, yes?
Yeah. So DVC has for a number of years been reading like some variation of the same general Marxist-Leninist critique, which we've been told is bad because we should be Marxist-Leninist Maoists, but whatever. Anyway, basically, there was this article written by Alison Escalante a number of years ago at this point. I think it was Escalante
Allison,
18.
yes.
Yeah, and and Ali was Oregon's coach and is a friend and just a really smart person. And Ali wrote this article that gets cited all the time in LD and policy now in these CAF debates.
Oh, really?
And it was talking about dual power. And the way the dual power gets explained, I'm dumb, so I apologize if any of this is wrong, Ali. Forgive me. The way that gets explained functionally is that if there was a revolution, a socialist revolution, communist revolution that happened like tomorrow, it would fail. And the reason it would fail is because the proletariat is completely reliant upon the resources that are provided by the state. Like the state provides them benefits, provides them food, provides them infrastructure, to a certain degree provides them health insurance, provides them all these different things. And there is not a competitive offering from a socialist platform, from sort of a mutual aid perspective or whatever, to draw people away from the state. And the idea of dual power is that we have to cultivate these resources outside of the state that compete with the state's resources on a sort of zero-sum level, so that when we do have a revolution, people can actually stick with it and feel confident that like there's an option available to them that is workable. So otherwise, why would we have the revolution? And the way that we frame our critique is around that concept and then around the idea of propagandizing. And essentially what the way we frame the debate is that it should be sort of evaluated at the level of speech acts largely, even though we have impacts and whatnot. But the way we frame it is that in debate, all of our time to advocate for anything is zero sum. Every second that we spend talking about something that is not dual power or talking about why the state should do some really awesome thing inherently trades off with our ability to convince people to join a socialist platform, to join a socialist movement, to cultivate things like mutual aid and so on and so forth. And so we essentially say, like on the sort of like advocacy / alternative level, that like you should vote for us to endorse dual power as a means of producing the material conditions for the revolution. And then we just argue about why effective socialist movements have done similar things like these, and the state's not necessarily able to crush it. And we talk about like, why did the Bolsheviks succeed temporarily when the Mensheviks didn't, and so on and so forth. But what we went for as far as the links was obviously about stuff about space and how space is a part of the problem of capitalism, and like this is just a further hegemonic expansion of it. It's sort of like the ultimate expression of Western paternalism and things of that nature, how it's inherently militaristic to a certain degree, and how obviously the people who will be sent to the moon will not be the proletariat, but will be the ultra wealthy, the elite, just a bourgeois dream, essentially. And we like to read this K in general if we're going to read a KF, but it especially made sense in the context of this round, where we were reading it in front of some judges who'd already seen it before, and so we're like, okay, they're gonna maybe fill in some blanks for us, and we just thought it was way ahead on the anthro, because obviously capitalism is like a big part of why animals are exploited and killed, because they can be commodified and they're not viewed as subjects and so on and so forth. But we also have this whole silly section that we never got to read that I'm really sad about, because Pacific didn't end up reading anthro. They just read they and so I'll get to that in a second, but we were so prepared for them to read anthro, and they were told to prepare anthro. They just didn't. This team I guess couldn't get it down in prep. But we had this whole preempt about the concept of beasts of burden. And they're like, why that's like a capitalist like function, you know what I mean? And like whatever. But ignoring that, what Pacific did do was read like long form framework kind of topicality style arguments saying we don't get to read the K, and then read a counterplan. And the counterplan was ban the resolution, really, where they said counterplan, the United States federal government should ban the establishing of a permanent moon base. And then they went for like, if all of your links are true about why building a moon base is bad, then the counterplan solves better. And we went for A, we can perm the shit out of that, and B, we framed out all of this stuff about why the state is bad. But basically, the real reason we like dual power so much from a perm debate perspective, whether it's on the app or the negative, is dual power by definition is about building resources that compete with the state, that draw attention and reliance away from the state. So any permutation or counterplan in this instance that says cultivate further reliance on the state by having the state do an action is inherently mutually exclusive or not competitive with the alternative / advocacy statement. And so in the end, it ended up being a 2-1 decision. The first judge that voted for us voted just on the framework. They said that we were just ahead on the framework debate. They conceded the sort of propagandizing level stuff, which means that we're just ahead on the speech acts. The second judge voted against us, and they basically said that if everything you're saying is true about the moon base being bad, then I think the negative is correct, that the counterplan solves better. I don't understand how voting for you actually builds towards a socialist platform. And then the last judge voted on, I think, functionally the permutation, saying that we get to do both, and there's no reason why we can't ban the plan and do this thing, which isn't really what we were going for, but if that's what they want to vote on, cool. It was somewhat confusing, but yeah, in the end, it was a 2-1 for DVC over Pacific.
And you're touching upon how you'd bring up paternalism arguments, and I was just thinking you could really incorporate a lot of metaphors about, launching a large phallus into space and inseminating, the rest of space with human beings, and oh my God, you could just go wild on the imagery there, and that would, I had that in my back pocket for some of these space race arguments before. It would be fun. You get a chuckle out of people, a little embarrassing smile every once in a while. I think it's so it's good stuff. Well, hey, that's the time that we got for this. It was a great discussion. I think that I love space related topics. Sometimes you can avoid the politics, not always in this case. This one's pretty clearly bringing in a lot of international relations into it, but thanks for the background and the deep dive on this particular topic. All right.
Thank you.
We will be back in the future. It's Paul and Jared. We're DebateSensei. We'll see you again. Bye.